What's up, everyone? Today we have an exciting topic that I love to talk about, believe it or not. And although I don't usually talk about it in my YouTube videos, it is something that I do talk a lot about with my friends when we're just chilling and hanging out, you know what I'm saying? And so today's topic is sex and God. And our guest today, or should I say a sexpert, who will be giving us some insights into this topic is the awesome Dr. Darrel Ray. So he's a psychologist who's written books such as Sex and God, How Religion Distorts Sexuality, and The God Virus, How Religion Infects Our Lives and Culture. And he's also one of the founders of an organization called Recovering from Religion. So Darrel, is it cool I call you Darrel or
Yep.
Doctor? Okay.
Oh, no, please.
Darrel.
My friends call me Darrell.
Oh, cool. All right, I'm your friend now. Awesome.
My enemies, other than.
It's awesome to have you on the show, man.
Great. Thanks for having me on, Joshua.
Oh, for sure. It's one thing to talk about sex, and it's usually another thing to talk about God. And where these two topics are usually kept separate, but you love talking about both of them together. So, tell us your story, just a little bit of your background of where you're coming from, and tell us how things eventually led to your interest in talking about sex and God together.
Well, I'm a psychologist. As you know, all psychologists are perverts. So that answers all your questions, doesn't it?
All right, next question. No.
That's okay. That's only partly true. From a very early age, I was very interested in sex, as most human beings are.
Exactly.
And I noticed from a very early age that what they told me in church, and I went to a very conservative, even fundamentalist church, what they told me in church and what I was experiencing seemed to be in conflict a lot, like masturbation and all.
Right.
Thank goodness my parents weren't too uptight about masturbation. My mom caught me one day when I was 12 years old, walked in the bedroom, and I was just embarrassed as hell about it, and she sat down on my bed and said, it's okay. You won't do it when you get married. Well, that was...
There's a limit. There's a limit.
She was a little bit more enlightened than most of the other people in the church, but she was wrong even on that point. I can tell you that, having been married. But so I was just amazed as I got into college, and I majored in anthropology and sociology, and I noticed that we studied lots of cultures. In fact, I just pulled an old paper out I did on the Havasupai Indians who are a tribe that lives today. They live in the bottom of the Grand Canyon. Now, at one point in time, before contact with Western culture, they'd live half the year on the bottom and half the year on the top, hunting and gathering and coming back down. Anyway, I did an anthropology project on them. I went there, I interviewed people on the reservation and all, and I realized at the ripe old age of 21 that these people, the Havasupai tribe's sexual practices, especially before contact with the West, were really, really different from ours. And I'd been taught all my life, this XYZ over here is normal. When I look at the Havasupai Indians, I follow ABC is normal for them. And it was really, really different. For example, women are the controllers and the leaders of in many ways of the tribe, especially in matters of sex.
Oh, wow.
And women could oftentimes have multiple sex partners, and marriage was a very, very loose. They did have marriage, but it was very loose.
Yeah.
And a man might be married to a woman and be living with another woman. And it was just not uncommon, and nobody was all hot and bothered about it until the missionaries arrived. So there was some of that going on, and then there's just so much. If you look at anthropology, and I would say one of the biggest influences of my life was just reading about other cultures, and I mean reading it from the direct witness of a person going and living in that culture, or being right there, watching culture, and man, there's so many different sexual practices. If you read my book, Sex and God, I talk a lot about other cultures.
Yeah.
And the reason I do that is I want to debunk this notion that Christians or Christianity is the right way to do sex or to do relationships. Even Christians, if you think about it, are all out to lunch on that, because the Muslims have a whole different way of doing it. You know, you can have
Right.
4 wives if you're a Muslim, and that
Right.
kind of thing. Or the Hindus, the same thing. You know, it's a polygamous culture where a man can have multiple wives. Now that's all changing. We're seeing that, but still, those are other ways of doing things. I certainly don't approve of polygamy, and that's very different than other things like polyamory that we can talk about if you want. But so I just saw all this stuff, and then I was very religious. I still was religious. I was a very liberal religious person, but still religious. So I went off to graduate school, Scarrett College for Christian Workers. And while I was at Scarrett College, I was probably hit on by more gay men than I've ever been hit on in my life.
All right.
And I'm thinking, this is a seminary, and all these guys are gay. What's going on here?
So they were openly gay, like letting people know, or just like in private kind of thing, you know?
It was in 1973.
Oh, yeah.
And the sexual revolution was still going on pretty strong. So I would say it was kind of 50-50. Some were kind of closeted, some were out. Certainly on campus, they seemed to be more out than off campus. And I'm very straight. I mean, I'm just straight. I just have never had an inkling to be gay. It's just not me.
Right.
I have no problems with it, obviously. But I was just, all these guys are in the seminary. And then I realized there's lots of lesbian women in this seminary too. This is crazy.
Yeah.
I was coming out of a very conservative Christian background. I'd only met one gay guy in my whole life until I went to graduate school.
Out of all places too.
Yeah, right. And of course, that's a fantasy. I've lots of gay guys. I just didn't know it. You know, I'd probably met lots of lesbian women and didn't know it. But when you come out of that bubble, the Christian bubble, and you get exposed to something else. Oh, and the funny thing was, this is Nashville, Tennessee. That's where Scarrett College for Christian Workers is. Nashville, Tennessee.
Wow.
So this was just an eye-opener to me, and I realized, wow, even the Christians can't practice this stuff. And then, of course, throughout my childhood, we had minister after minister having affairs and getting forgiven for having the affairs, and then having another affair and getting forgiven again. And we had one minister that was caught 3 times before they finally fired him. And I realized these guys can't practice. I mean, if this stuff really worked, if Jesus in your marriage really works, then the people who are most faithful would be those people who are most infected with the notions.
Right.
The ministers, the elders. We had elders screwing all sorts of people they shouldn't have been screwing.
Right.
And we had ministers screwing people they shouldn't have been screwing. Now, none of it was illegal. It's not like it wasn't non-consensual. It wasn't rape or anything. It was legal if in non-ethical sense, but in terms of ethics of their ethics, it was illegal. It was immoral.
Yeah. And that's one thing I want to bring up then, you know, because I've seen it too. So it is crazy that you hear about pastors preaching from the pulpit like passionately against, you know, what they consider to be sexual sins, quote unquote, and then there's all these scandals happening, you know, with the like you said, the pastor sleeping with so and so, or even their secretary or priests are being exposed for molesting boys, and so, like you said, these are supposedly against their beliefs. But why do you think that their behavior is no different than like the average church attendee or from like secular people? Quote unquote, you know?
Well, in some ways, they're worse than secular people. The evidence tends to show that there is a difference. It's not a huge difference, but there is a difference in the sexual behavior of religious people versus the sexual behavior of non-religious people. For example, pornography. There's evidence going back about 15 years that religious people actually watch more pornography than non-religious people do.
Yeah, I heard of that.
Which is really weird because they're preaching against pornography all the time.
Right. Don't do it, except
right. And then if you look at divorce rates, there's a slight but clear difference between religious and non-religious. The non-religious don't get divorced quite as much as the religious do.
Right.
And then if you look at ministers have the same divorce rates as their denomination. And like Baptists have a higher divorce rate than most other religious groups, and the ministers have the same divorce rate as their denomination, which is higher than secular. Oklahoma has a higher divorce rate than Massachusetts. Massachusetts being one of the most secular states in the nation, Oklahoma one of the most religious. And this thing after thing after thing you can identify that there's a correlation. Now, we know that correlation isn't causation, but after a while, when you see these correlations, one after the other happening, that tells you something. For example, Mississippi and Utah, two of the number 1 and number 2 in religiosity, are also number 1 and number 2 in porn viewing, the very thing they preach most against. So what is in my book, the God Virus, I talk about something I call the guilt cycle. And people are taught from a very early age that their bodies are their enemies, that they are broken, that they are not whole, that they have to have Jesus to become whole. And only Jesus can forgive them from being broken in the first place. So if you're taught from a very early age that you're a worthless piece of shit, and you can't do anything about it unless Jesus comes into your life. Right. I mean, look at the conflict that creates. Yeah. I take, and I look at it and I think, okay, after I finished my degree in seminary, I went to graduate school in psychology. And of course, in psychology, we're trying to help people heal from trauma and problems and issues, that are keeping them from being fully functional in today's world or in their life. And I realized about 80% of the problems I'm seeing in my office, very early on, I noticed about 80% of them are directly related to people's religious training. And so, I mean, this is all stuff before I'm 30 years old. I'm starting to see this and figure it out. But it took me another 20 plus years to really put it all together. A lot of research, a lot of observation, a lot of talking to a lot of clients. And I just finally realized there's something to be written here. And so when I wrote The God Virus, and that was a bestseller, and I just, I got tons and tons of feedback from people about one chapter in that book. It was like that one chapter seemed to hit a real nerve, and that was chapter 5 on sex and the God Virus. And I thought, wow, people really are interested in this. So I started doing a little research, and I found no one had ever written a book on sex and God. Now, to me, that's just obvious. Religion and sex are always together. I mean, how many sermons are being preached every Sunday about what you do in your bedroom?
Right.
And yet nobody ever written. Now, I'm not saying Christians don't. Christians are writing about sex and God all the time, but it's from a delusional perspective. They don't know anything about the biology or the anthropology or the sociology of human sexuality. They're just pulling stuff out of their, proverbial posterior.
You can say it.
Yeah. So I just said, okay, I'm going to write about this because nobody has ever written a book on this. And I'm serious. It's even today, it's hard for me to believe that nobody's ever written a book on this.
Yeah.
Now, since Sex and God came out, there's been 2 or 3 other books that have come out and dealt with a similar subject. So I can't say that anymore. Yeah. But before Sex and God, no one had ever written it. But the reason I point that out is that shows you the power of religion to make you blind to the obvious. It is fucking obvious that religion influences your sex life in devastatingly negative ways, and yet nobody is talking about it. Or nobody's writing about it. To me, that's pretty interesting.
Yes, I mean, it's pretty much like control. They just shame you. When I was growing up, I dealt with a lot of shame, because I was told I was a sinner, I was wretched, and, anything that had to do with sex or anything like that was a no-no. It was taboo, and then, like I said, I would see these people at church. They would sometimes get away with it. Sometimes they wouldn't. They would get called out, and, be embarrassed in front of the congregation and stuff like that. And, there was something in your book where you said that, religion is often an excuse for bad behavior, So can you elaborate on that?
Well, we've just seen Josh Duggar. How much bad behavior can you get out of a guy?
Right.
And he's still getting forgiven.
Exactly.
And he got forgiven and forgiven and forgiven. 5 different women, girls, in this case, his sisters, or 3 or 4 of them, he molested, and he knew, and he did it with the knowledge of his parents, and they did almost nothing to prevent that from happening or continuing. And then when they finally did something about it, it was to send him off to meet some guy in Little Rock, Arkansas, and stay with him to help build a house or rehab a house. And that's what they called counseling for him. Now, the guy that did the rehab was a former sheriff's deputy who now is in prison for child pornography charges, I believe. Isn't that interesting?
Right.
I mean, everywhere you turn around the Duggars, there's all sorts of sexual stuff going on. And then you've got a whole family, a whole culture, subculture really, that I love what Aaron Ra, he calls it the clown car theology. And that is that a woman's vagina is a clown car. Let's see how many clowns we can get out of it, or how many babies in this case. And he's right. There's this theology is just crazy. The sexuality is reproduce as much as you possibly can without regard to anything else, And you do it because of Jesus. That's all. God said, get out there and have babies.
Yeah.
Now, I don't have any problems with people having big families. I mean, I do have some problems in terms of just this planet can only hold so many people.
Right.
So that's not the issue. The issue, at least with respect to the Duggars, is their job is to put as many Jesus nuts on this planet as they can.
Right.
And they've got 19 and counting. And the oldest one has turned out to be quite a difficult nut for them. But he's still a nut.
Yeah.
And they just sent him off. I posted a bunch of stuff on my Facebook page and Secular Sexuality podcast page the last 2 days. Duggars are keeping me really busy. I should send them a thank you. I had one radio show and 4 podcasts this week. You're the second podcast and the third show I've been on just this week because of the Duggars. Well, largely because of the Duggars.
Yeah.
And what happened was he's checked himself into a quote rehab clinic. So I did a little research on this rehab clinic, and I find out they have not one single trained professional on their staff. No medical people at all. It's all ministers and Christian people. And I looked at the qualifications of the counselors, and all the counselors looked to me to be pretty young. I mean, like in their 20s. And you look at their qualifications, and the best qualification I could find was that most of them were drug addicts or alcoholics as recently as 2 years ago. Now, isn't that interesting? But they found Jesus.
Right.
Once they found Jesus, then they can...
Yeah. That's a solution. They know everything now,
They do, and they can help Josh Duggar. Now, that's interesting. I'll bet Josh Duggar knows more about his religion than the counselor that'll be counseling.
Right.
Because he's older, and he's been in a family that was really beat it into his head.
Right.
So he's getting away. It's a get forgiveness from Jesus is a get out of jail free card.
Yeah. I
guarantee you 6 or 8 weeks from now, he'll be back.
Right.
You remember Ted Haggard who
of course
railed against homosexuals and then got caught with a gay prostitute. Well, he went down to Phoenix. It took him 2 years to come back, but he was back in 2 years. He is still preaching in a big church. He's created a new church there in Colorado Springs, and he's been forgiven by Jesus, and he's back, condemning the gays again and everybody else that doesn't agree with him. What happens is they can get out of jail free in terms of there's no accountability for their behavior. Yeah, Josh Duggar was on Ashley Madison. Josh Duggar actually had sex at least twice with a porn star. And so we know he's cheating on his wife. And even us atheists, and I'm an atheist, know that's inappropriate. You really ought to have an honest, open relationship with whoever you're involved with sexually. And he didn't. Now, I'm very open about my sex life. If I got a whole podcast about it. I mean, I don't advertise all the gory details, but that's not appropriate. I am open about it, and I'm open with anybody that I'm involved with. Because that secretness is inappropriate if you're going to be an honest, open human being. And he has never learned that. Josh Duggar never learned in his family of origin about boundaries. Other people's bodies are not his property. He cannot touch his sisters or molest other girls outside of his family. He never learned that. And he was also told from a very early age that masturbation is wrong, that you're going to hell if you masturbate. Now, this guy is probably got a high level of sexual energy. What are you going to do with it if you can't masturbate?
Yeah.
And when you do masturbate, you're going to feel guilty as hell when you're finished. What do you do with that guilt?
Yeah.
Well, you heard that he was very violent with the porn star he got in bed with, according to her. Now, we're taking her story about it, but this is one of those things where you have to ask, why would she make this shit up? She doesn't need to. And it's not like 72 other women are coming forward on this. She's one and seems to have been in the right place at the right time when he was there. So anyway, it's kind of fun. The interesting thing, there's a new development just happened yesterday. Dr. Epting at North Grenville University in North Carolina, I think it was, no, South Carolina, I think it was, his last March or February, I think it was, his own son videotaped him having an affair with another married woman. So here's the president of one of the most Christian conservative universities in the whole United States, North Grenville University. I mean, this university is so conservative you can't even have a bottle of vanilla in the cabinet or you get kicked out. Holding hands on campus is having sex before marriage. All those things will get you kicked off campus. And here's the president screwing somebody who's also married. Now, in the Bible, that means both of them get stoned to death.
Right.
And there's guys out there, the Huckabee types, and there's several of these ministers saying, yeah, we ought to go back to stoning gays. But they never talk about stoning adulterers.
Right. Yeah, it's always the gay ones that are they're really bad,
And I just read a great article on, where was it? I forget, online today, just news article on where's the indignation of the religious right about the whole Ashley Madison thing.
Oh, right.
Why aren't we hearing, they come out and they rant and they rave and they yell as loud as they can about gays and gay marriage, but the Bible actually says nothing about gays and gay marriage. It says nothing about abortion. Right. There's zero. Jesus never said anything about abortion or gay marriage or homosexuality. And yet they yell about that. Jesus was really clear about adultery.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There's no mistaking it, but yet you can hear a pin drop on the religious right. There's nobody's hollering about Ashley Madison. And I'll guarantee you it's because a lot of them have got their
because they got caught. Wow. And so, think about like why are people so afraid to talk about sex? It's interesting because even my married couple friends, they're, even when I bring up sex, they still get uncomfortable with it. And then, and then even you found out on, I guess you looked up on Amazon or wherever, there's hardly any books on that topic, at least from a religious understanding or trying to see it in context. So why do you think people are so afraid to talk about it though?
Because number one, our culture really is very religious and very conservative religious. We've been programmed since the Puritans came over here about sex being shameful, sex is wrong, sex will send you to hell. Even if you're secular, you've still been infected with some of these ideas.
Right.
For example, the whole notion of porn addiction. I've been on a kind of a campaign the last year or so, challenging people to try and say, look, this whole thing about porn addiction is a religious idea. It is not a secular idea. And we need to challenge that. I've got a whole talk on YouTube. You can go and see. I did it free OK in June. I think it's got something like 12,000 views already. It's a lot of people have looked at it. I know secular people. I just read somebody on Reddit this morning said, I'm an atheist and I know that porn addiction is real. Now, of course, they have no evidence. And they didn't bother to watch my talk, and they haven't read my book, and they haven't read Dr. David Lay's book on the myth of sex addiction and any of those people, or Dr. Marty Klein, who's written a great article for Humanist Magazine on the myth of sex addiction. He didn't bother to read any of that, yet he's an atheist saying it's really a thing.
Right.
And I'm here to say, no, it's not really a thing. I've had people say, masturbation will ruin your marriage. I'm an atheist and I know it'll ruin your marriage. Well, where the hell did you figure that out? Are you a sex expert? And so I'm here to challenge secularists. I'm here to challenge religious people too. You are ignorant about human sexuality if you think there's such a thing as sex addiction. If you think that masturbation will ruin your marriage. If you think that pornography is something you can get addicted to, you don't understand human sexuality.
Yeah. So what does your research say about that stuff? So I every so often I get emails from people asking me for help because they're addicted to porn, and they say stuff like it could destroy their marriage and stuff like that. So what does your research tell you about that whole idea of does it destroy marriages or relationships? Does it have a certain negative effect on the brain or something like that?
Okay, well, first of all, I will just tell your listeners, or if you have somebody, send them straight to that talk.
Sure.
50 minutes later, they will have a whole different... I've had people come into my talks. There were 500 people in that room, and I dare say 200 of them probably believed there was sex addiction. It was a real thing until they heard my talk. And I pretty much know that nobody left that room thinking it was a real thing afterwards. So that alone, just in getting informed, that's all you have to do. Yeah. And once you realize that sex addiction is a way to get you back to Jesus, I mean, that's what Josh Duggar, one of the first things he says, I've strayed from my wife. I started watching porn. I became a porn addict, and then that led me to have affairs. So he's blaming his porn. No, the fact is he is fucking screwed up by his own parents about his sexuality.
Right.
If he knew, if he had been taught early on about masturbation is okay, fantasies are okay, watching porn is okay, touching other people inappropriately is not okay, and having sex outside your marriage without talking it through and with consent from your partner is inappropriate and wrong. He was never taught any of that. He was just said, he's just given some real rigid rules.
Right. It's all these prohibitions. You can't do this. You can't do that. So obviously it's wrong. So I'll do it secretly.
Don't. Nobody taught him how to masturbate properly. Nobody sat him down and said, look, don't do it in public, obviously, but and you can use these things. Nobody told him that women can use dildos. I mean, he probably condemns women who use dildos, stuff like that. Oh gosh, we got off track there. What was I getting ready to tell you?
Let's talk about masturbation then, because that's a big thing. Even in my seminary days, I remember the guys on the floor in my dorm. They would have meetings about they'd be struggling with masturbation, and they'd feel really, really guilty. They'd be like, "Oh, I went for like a week. I went without a month without doing," and then they fall back into doing it again, and they feel more like shit. And so that's one of the things. I'm like, wow, this is really like eating people up inside. So.
It is.
So for a lot of it's natural. So like for a lot of religious people, it's bad. It's sinful. But from your research and studies, are there any benefits to it?
Oh, there's tons of benefits. I mean, first thing, it gives a hell of a lot of pleasure.
Yeah.
And just because you don't have a sex partner, you are the first sex partner you'll ever have in your life.
Right.
And you're probably the last sex partner you're ever going to have in your life. So enjoy your own body. You need a sexual relationship with yourself, and then therein lies the contradiction to the Catholic or the Christian, Baptist, whatever dogma. The first person you need to have a sexual relationship is with you.
Right.
You need to enjoy your body. It's the only body you're ever going to get. You're not going to get a new body in heaven. You got one now. Appreciate it. Enjoy it. Teach yourself how to give yourself pleasure. And then when you do have a sexual partner, you'll be more educated about your body and you can teach them. Right. I've had women come into my office, for example, and they say, my husband can't give me an orgasm. I've never had an orgasm. And I mean, they're 40 years old. I've had 40-year-old women in my office saying, I've never had an orgasm. My husband can't give me an orgasm. I say, okay, well, let's start really back. When did you first start masturbating? And the woman would say, oh, I've never masturbated. That's wrong. Okay, now they're not necessarily secular. They may still be religious, of course. I say, well, okay, if you can't give yourself an orgasm, why the hell do you expect your husband to give you an orgasm?
Right.
Is there something wrong with this picture?
Yeah.
So, masturbation is such a fundamental thing. Almost every primate masturbates. We're just one of the other primates, of course. So it's very good. It's got a lot of benefits. One of the benefits is that your sperm, for men, only lasts for about 5 days inside your body, and then they start getting old. and useless, and so you need to get rid of them.
Yeah.
So if you're not masturbating on a regular basis, you're accumulating old, dead sperm in your system.
Or you're having wet dreams.
See, well, you need wet dreams. You got to do something. So you get rid of the sperm, the old sperm, and that stimulates new sperm come in. What it means is when you do have sex, your sperm are healthy and ready to fertilize an egg.
Right, right.
That's another thing is the more you know your own body and the more you stimulate yourself, ultimately the easier it is for you to interact with somebody else around your own body. You'll get more comfortable with it. Now, on the other side, for women's masturbation keeps the whole vaginal tract, reproductive tract, clean and flowing. The more if a woman masturbates on a regular basis, she lubricates very easily. Her body learns and responds quicker. So it's easier for her to have orgasms. I've met many women that once they really learned and got comfortable and said, my body is my body and I'm going to enjoy it. And they started experimenting and playing with themselves and giving themselves their own orgasms. Then they could teach their partner how to give them an orgasm too.
Yeah.
So masturbation, I've had people tell me I talk too much about masturbation. But here's the deal. It's the most fundamental sexual activity you're going to have in your whole lifetime. How can I talk too much about it?
Right, right.
Now, there are people out there who don't masturbate and aren't even interested in it, and that's fine. There's probably somewhere between 3 and 5% of the population has never masturbated. They're just not interested in it. And I have no problems with that. Also, when you're really sexually satisfied, and everybody's sex drive is different. I mean, we've got different levels, just like our appetites are different and our music tastes are different. We all have different levels of energy around sex. If somebody's got a fairly low libido, low sex drive, having sex once a week, once a month may be plenty for them, and with their partner, and they don't even need to masturbate.
Yeah.
For me, if I'm not having sex 2 times a day, something like that, I'm miserable. I mean, it's just, so that's the difference. You can have somebody who once a month is fine, and somebody else that 5 times a day is about right. I'm serious.
Right.
When early on in my therapy practice back in the 1980s, I had several clients, men and women, come in and say I masturbate 10 and 12 times a day. And that wasn't the issue. It was no big deal. That wasn't why they were in my office. So how many times you masturbate is, a lot of people say, I masturbate too much. Well, okay, how do you know that?
Yeah.
What's the standard?
Yeah, that's too much.
Yeah. And now it's not to say that you couldn't overdo it, that it might get in the way. So what we do is when people are overdoing something, for example, overeating,
like with anything, obviously,
we don't say, okay, what we really want to do is look underneath the symptom. The symptom is, oh, you want to have 5 bowls of ice cream before you go to bed. Well, that's probably not a healthy thing to do.
Oh no, I'm sorry.
You want to masturbate 12 times a day, and that interferes with you getting your work done. Yeah, okay, well, that's probably not a good thing to do.
Right.
Let's look at what might be driving that behavior. And what we see oftentimes is underlying beliefs, ideas. For example, the person, in either case, the 5 bowls of ice cream or the 12 times a day masturbating oftentimes can go right back to, I just got a divorce. I'm depressed. I'm lonely. I'm unhappy right now. So are we going to treat the ice cream eating, or are we going to treat the depression?
Right.
That's the problem with treating things like sex addiction. When you label, you masturbate too much or you have a porn addiction, you're labeling the symptom. You're not labeling the actual underlying cause.
Like the cause of, and that's one thing that when I would hear stories of people where they would talk about masturbation ruin our marriage, or even watching too much porn or whatever, I'm like, well, you could do that with anything. It could be you hanging out too much with the boys or something, and you're neglecting your wife, or you're watching sports all the time and you're not spending time with your partner or something like that. So that's what I've always found interesting throughout the years, of just like, well, why are you blaming that?
Yeah,
you know, I mean, there is something deeper, and that's what I like, there's this whole thing with sexual repression, and it is something that for myself growing up as a Christian, it was something that I struggled with a lot. So honestly, I wish I knew all this stuff before. So thankfully, I'm still young, but there were a lot of years where just everything was so bad. I was like trying to stay Mr. Purity Boy and stay clean and all that. And back in the day, I was a pastor.
Oh, you
So
were?
yeah, I was a pastor for several years, and
Wow.
so I used to, I had to set the example, and I was trying to do my best, and so what we would do is that we would form something called, I find it cheesy now, but we would form like accountability groups where
Oh,
we go
yeah.
over this book called Every Man's Battle. Have you ever heard of that
Yeah.
book?
Oh,
So
yes.
that's like the standard book for like a
It
lot of us
is.
young guys, and they have a girls version. And so we'd meet up like every week, because obviously sex is something that goes on in our minds all the time. But
Yeah.
and then we would like confess our
Yeah, but
so-called sexual sins,
yeah.
and then we would feel embarrassed. And I remember, like one of the guys was talking about how he was, struggling with porn. So in order to resist it, he would put his computer in the closet, and then we would talk about that during the meeting, and then we would pray, that he'll overcome the temptation, and we would have our meetings. And then I would find out that after our meeting, he would take the computer right out and start watching porn again.
Oh, hell
And
yeah.
he'll feel more, but he would feel more like crap though,
Yeah.
because there was that guilt that would drive him, you know what
Yeah.
I'm saying? And so, growing up like that as a Christian, like sex, it was primarily like we would learn it from the Bible, supposedly, right? That's
Yeah.
what we were told. The Bible has all the answers.
Right.
And to be honest, there wasn't much like practically that we could learn from it, except, don't have a hint of sexual immorality, because God
Yeah.
knows your thoughts. And I remember reading that verse back in it, like, there should not even be a hint. And I'm like, what? Like, how is that even possible?
It's not.
Or what does that even mean?
Yeah.
Right. And
I
so,
call it the don't think of a pink elephant.
exactly, right? You tell someone don't do it and they do it. And so, like, we would, we tried and tried and tried and tried and tried to stay pure. We would do something called bouncing the eyes. Don't watch porn for
Yeah.
sure. Don't watch certain rated R movies. Don't watch even certain rated PG-13 movies, because some of
Yeah.
them were considered like raunchy. And some people, they would even hold hands because it could supposedly lead to other things. And I'm like, oh my gosh, how are we gonna survive in this world? And there was even this one program, like when I was back in Asia, like one of my friends told me that they were struggling with porn. And so I don't know if you heard of this, but if there's, it's like an accountability thing that if you end up watching porn, your friends will be notified,
Yeah.
just so they could keep you accountable. And I'm like, dude, of course you wouldn't want to do it then, because your friends are going to find out because of the shame culture
Yeah.
that we were
Right.
part of. And then throughout the years, like, and this is something that why I'm so thankful for your book, because your book was like the first book that ever put into words my thoughts, because I started to realize, because even though I wasn't talking about sex for a while, like I had my own thoughts, obviously, because of my own ways I saw the damage it's done to me of how religion has used a lot of guilt. I eventually realized that the more you try not to do something, like that pink elephant example
Yeah.
you gave, the more you end up doing it, and there's that whole saying, that which you resist, it persists. And so I really saw the guilt drive me to do things. And
Yes.
but it wasn't until, and like, no one told me to do this. It was just something that I just, also my wife was actually a part of this journey with me, where the more I accepted and embraced my sexuality, the more I started to see things as just normal. Like it wasn't a big deal. If I see a naked woman, it's no big deal, and back in the day, I'd be like, oh, my heart would start beating fast because it's a sin, and I'd be walking out of movie theaters and stuff like that because I'd feel bad because God's watching me,
Yes. Right. Right.
or Jesus. And this is like so like odd, right? Like I imagine Jesus would be like standing there shaking his head in disappointment, which is so kind of weird, right? To have
It
Jesus
is.
watching me do stuff,
A friend of mine uses to contrast the United States and our attitudes about all this, seeing naked women or whatever. He says, you know what they call a topless beach in Italy?
What's that?
A beach.
Exactly, right? You know what I'm saying? So I mean,
They,
it's
they don't
so
care.
normal.
It's
It's
no
so
big
normal.
deal. It's when you
Um,
sexualize everything, then you start seeing everything as sexual.
Yeah.
And
You
the religion is just consumed. The people, religionists tell us, me, I'm an atheist, tell us secularists that we're all want to be atheists so we can sin and have sex anytime.
Yeah, it gives you a
Well, the
license to
fact
do
is,
whatever.
I'm not nearly as consumed with sex and sexuality as Josh Duggar is, or with his family, or with or Mike Huckabee, or any of these guys that are constantly talking about sex. They talk about sex more than I do, and I'm a sex educator.
Right. So, exactly. I mean, they're just finally getting it out there, because it's been repressed for so many years, So I mean, like, one question that came up, because I heard one of your talks yesterday, and I like how you made a distinction. But what is the difference between guilt and shame to you?
That's a great question. I go to a whole chapter in both my books. I actually talk about guilt, but guilt and shame and sex and God, because people confuse those two and don't realize how they function. Shame is a communal emotional experience. I feel shame if my community finds out I masturbate, or if my community. And so you see shame cultures and shame religions. For example, Islam is a very shame-based religion, but it's shamed around a community. So you have to have a cohesive community that finds out I'm having sex outside of marriage, and then the entire community comes down on me and shames me. In some aspects, some areas of Islam, you can get killed for violating these shame boundaries. I mean, women get stoned. Girls get beheaded because they had sex or they kissed them or something in Iran and places like that, Saudi Arabia. So the shame is a cultural, social thing, but what happens when you don't have a very tight community? You go to Saudi Arabia, almost everybody you're going to come in contact with is a Sunni Muslim. So there's a very deeply connected, tightly woven culture that if you violate one of the shame boundaries, the entire culture will come down on you. But in the United States, we don't have a monolithic religious system around us.
Right.
You got a Baptist on one side of you in your neighborhood, and you got a Catholic on the other side, and you might even have now Hindus or Buddhists somewhere in your neighborhood.
Yeah.
So there could be all sorts. So it's very difficult to maintain a shame-based culture and a shame-based religion if there's not a tight community.
Right.
Now, Catholicism was very shame-based for many, many years, until, as I write about in the book Sex and God, until the Reformation came and Martin Luther, and the Lutherans split off and the Presbyterians, everybody started going their own way. That breaks down the shame-based community. So you have to have a different way of keeping people in line with respect to your religion, and guilt does that. If you think of shame and guilt as a continuum, on a scale of 1 to 10, a 1 is hugely shameful, a 10 is hugely guilty. Well, the two kind of meet in the middle. You can have shame and guilt work together. Now, when I've been taught since I was young that masturbation is wrong, I can masturbate all day in the privacy of my home, and nobody in my community will know it. I can look at porn, and nobody will know it. But I know Jesus is watching me, so I feel guilty anyway. So it's the guilt. Guilt is an individual, generally a more individualized emotion, whereas shame is a more communal emotion. Now they definitely work together, because when I come back, what's happening, and you described it really well, Joshua, when you go to this group and you all hold hands and you pray that you're not going to succumb to the temptation. And then somebody says, well, but you watch porn, or I confess that I watch porn. That's the shame component coming out.
Yeah.
And religions really strive to get the shame in there. Shame is far more effective at controlling your behavior than guilt is.
Yeah.
You can feel guilty as hell about masturbating, but you're still going to do it.
Right.
Shame seems to have a better way of keeping you in line.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's perfect by a long shot, but the two work together. Is that what you were asking?
Oh, yeah. That's perfect. That's what I heard yesterday. I just wanted you to explain it for my listeners, and I've seen that, there's this whole, just the whole community shaming. I just met up with a couple last week. They were listening to my podcast, and then they wanted to meet up with me last week. And then they were talking about how they would go to this one retreat where you write down all your sins, and then you say it out loud.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, what's the purpose of that? I mean,
here's the difference between shame religions and guilt religions, and it's pretty clear. shame religions are much more cult-like.
Yeah.
And they want to use shame. So you get Jehovah's Witnesses. They're definitely a cult. Some aspects in some areas, Catholicism is very much a cult.
Sure.
Seventh-day Adventists, very much a cult. And they use those techniques to shame the members.
Yeah.
But Presbyterians are more guilt-focused, and Baptists are more guilt-focused.
Here's an important question. So, like, for those who are, they have kids, how would you suggest or recommend that, how would the whole topic of sex come up? Do you have any suggestions? Because a lot of my friends, they have kids now. They just gave birth, and some of them have little toddlers. What would you suggest on how to have the quote-unquote the talk,
Well, okay, Joshua, let's say that is an entire other podcast discussion. I wouldn't want to try to get into that one in the first place.
Really? Okay.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries.
I did, back in January, I did a podcast episode on Seth Andrews, the Thinking Atheist, where I talked about that very thing. And we did a whole, almost an hour of how do you deal with the kid issues.
Yeah.
My own podcast, it's 3 episodes ago. I'm not sure which number it was. The Our Whole Lives. I interviewed Dr. Melanie Davis, who's head of the Our Whole Lives program for the Unitarian Church. And it's an amazing sex education program that's age appropriate for kids from kindergarten on up through adulthood. I mean, even into late adulthood. It's a great program that's sex positive, gender neutral. I mean, lots of things about it are just excellent. I interviewed her because there's very little out there for secularists on how to raise your children sex positive without a lot of religious, dogma getting into it. So that's a place I would look. Those two, Our Whole Lives. You can just Google that one and look at that program. It's awesome. Okay. You can send your kids to a Unitarian church. And they'd get great sex education there.
I heard about that. So lastly, because I don't want to take up too much of your time. For my listeners who I'm sure there's some of them that are struggling with shame, with sexuality and stuff. What would you say to them right now, just to give them some encouragement? Like if they were just standing in front of you, what would you say when they're struggling themselves with shame?
Well, I would say, where did you learn that shame? And examine that. And recognize you only get one life to live and you only have one body to live it in. Think of that really seriously. How much of your life do you want to waste feeling bad about something that's not real? Feeling bad about rules you were taught by people who didn't know diddly squat about human sexuality.
Yeah.
You're a sexual human being. You're a sexual person. You can behave responsibly sexually and have a hell of a lot of fun.
Right.
That's what sex is all about. It's having a lot of fun without hurting anyone else. But also say, be very responsible, understand what the ethics of sex, the secular ethics of sexuality are, because you're not just protecting yourself, you're protecting everybody you're involved with. So be safe with your sexual behaviors, but have a lot of fun with them. And nobody gets hurt by masturbating. So that's perfectly safe. That's the ultimate safe sex,
right?
Is masturbation.
Right.
I would like to let people know they can get my books.
Yeah, for sure. So how can they keep in touch with you? What's your
they
website?
Can go to my podcast, of course. I'm always talking about sex on my podcast.
What's the name of your podcast?
The Secular Sexuality Podcast.
Okay.
And it's a part of the Dogma Debate Network. And they can get my books on Amazon, of course.
Oh, for sure. I'll be linking those books, so don't worry. Are you working on any new books at the moment?
I tell you, my own speaking and just my life is already busy enough, and I don't write books just to be writing books. I write books when I'm inspired. So, no, I'm not. The podcast has taken a lot of my time. I'm really, really enjoying it.
Yeah.
Plus, I'm the chairman of the board of Recovering from Religion, and our organization is kicking some butt right now, doing some amazing things. And I'm also the director of the sub-project of Recovering from Religion, the Secular Therapy Project. Awesome. Where people can find a guaranteed secular therapist by going to our database at seculartherapy.org. But really the most exciting thing that's happening right now is our hotline. If you are going through a religious crisis, a crisis in whatever, and you want to talk to somebody, you can pick up the phone and call 1844. I doubt it. Or I can't remember that. I can't remember. But
No
anyway,
worry.
it's
We'll link it. We'll link it.
yeah, link it, because there's lots of people out there having doubts.
Yeah.
There's tons of people leaving church and they don't know where to turn.
Right.
Well, we are people to turn to. And when you call our hotline, you get somebody who's really well trained. We even have ministers, former ministers, answering our hotline. So these people are well trained. They're very knowledgeable. But most important, they're not there to convert you or deconvert you. They're just there to listen, ask questions, send you to resources. They'll even send you back to church if asking for it. I mean, seriously, you have people saying, well, it sounds to me like you are looking for a church home, but not one that's got the fundamentalist crazies that you raised in. So here's an opportunity. Here's a place you could go somewhere else. So the Hotline Project is the most exciting thing going on right now, I think, in almost the entire secular community.
Wow. That is so awesome. And don't worry, you guys, we'll be putting that in the link. Darrel, it's been fun, man. I'm sure you got a lot of people thinking about something. So thanks for being on the show.
Well, thank you, Joshua. Good to be on.
All right. Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Such an awesome interview. I love Darrel's energy and his perspective on things. Now, whether or not you agree with his views, you got to ask yourself, do my views about sex and God produce guilt in my life or freedom, right? And are they bringing about healthy or unhealthy relationships? And it's interesting because some of you listening to this interview might have thought, I don't know about that, or that's a stretch, while others suddenly felt this huge weight of guilt just lift off of them. Now, obviously, you can believe whatever you want about sexuality, but I'm just hoping this episode gave you something to think about, or hey, it might have even confirmed some things for you, I don't know. But if you want to dig deeper into this topic, remember I just teamed up with audible.com so you can download Darrel's book, Sex and God, absolutely free, with the free 30-day trial just so you can check them out. Now, to me, audiobooks are dope because you can just listen to them while you're driving or walking or cleaning the house or whatever. Just go to www.audibletrial.com/flipside. Again, that's www.audibletrial.com/flipside for Darrel's audiobook or pretty much any free audiobook of your choice, just in case you want to get something else. So go check it out. And if you enjoy this podcast, consider supporting me on something called Patreon. Because like I said, this does take money to produce, which comes out of my own pocket. And it does take up a lot of my time as well. And so Patreon is like a tip jar, right? It's like saying, hey, Josh, we support what you're doing. We love what you're doing. And we would love to keep the show going. And so any support would really mean a lot to me, guys. And for my Kindle promo, for my new book, The Secret to Awesomeness, it's still going on for a few more days. And then it's going to go back to its original price. So get it while you can, while there's this huge discount. And if you have it already, why not buy it as a gift for a friend? And it's cool because another person just messaged me a few days ago telling me how the book made them cry too. Just as I mentioned, someone shared that to me last week. And like I said, I love hearing that my books get people to think. But I also love knowing that it touches their hearts as well. And so get that book while you still can, while it's still on sale. And remember, all the links and the resources mentioned in the show will be in the description, so don't worry about it. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast, and if you can, I'd really appreciate it if you could write a review and rate it on iTunes. It only takes a few minutes, and it'll really help out the show. And please share this podcast with your friends. Alrighty, guys. Once again, thanks for listening, and I'll see you guys on the flip side. I'm out. Peace.